You are now listening to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. My guest today is Dr. Christoph Heilig, who is on the Faculty of Theology at the University of Basel in Switzerland. He has written extensively on the relationship between Paul and the Roman Empire, and his recent book, The Apostle and the Empire, analyzes the debate in New Testament scholarship surrounding Paul's supposedly hidden criticism of the Roman Empire. We are going to take a look at this excellent book on today's episode. Dr. Christoph Heilig, welcome to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for your interest in that book.
Hey, I'm really looking forward to it. This is exactly the kind of stuff I like to read. But before we get into the book, tell us a little about yourself, your background, and the work that you do.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, you've already said the most important things. My name is Christoph Heilig. I'm a New Testament scholar. Obviously, I'm doing work on Paul and the Empire. That has been an interest of mine for a long time. I'm also working on narratology, so the study of narratives, specifically in the letters of Paul, where we usually don't look for stories that much. And I have a more general interest in methodology and theoretical issues associated with New Testament studies. I studied theology in Germany and in Scotland, in St. Andrews, with N.T. Wright as one of my teachers. I did a PhD in New Testament studies at the University of Zurich, and I've been doing several postdocs ever since. I'm still doing a postdoc right now in Basel, currently transitioning to leading a research team as a postdoc at the University of Munich in Germany next year. Yeah, I think these are the most important things to know about my work.
That's great. When did you know that you wanted to study the New Testament professionally?
Well, I mean, initially I just wanted to learn to read the Bible in the original languages, and so I went to a kind of seminary in a German context. And then I was just not satisfied with the kind of education I was getting there, and I wanted to get into the philological stuff, textual criticism, and things like that. So even after 3 years of my undergraduate degrees, when we went to my wife and I, we went to St. Andrews. We went there for quite technical degree, a master of letters in biblical languages and literature. So a lot of textual criticism and stuff like that. And I found it quite fascinating back then. But it was really that experience in St. Andrews where I had a lot of support and just interest from professors and the opportunity to participate in conferences that positive feedback from scholars like John Barclay, whom I critiqued. That convinced me that there might be a place for myself in academia, and that I might have a certain talent for analyzing discourses and finding where we have to dig deeper, even though I'm not the kind of guy who is really able to then do this detailed work. And there are other people who know far better, know the sources far better, know far more languages and stuff like that. But I think I have a certain talent for identifying these loopholes in discourse. And so that's what I enjoy doing in scholarship.
Yeah, that's incredible. And I really do think that in your book, and we're going to talk about 2 Corinthians 2:14 later on, but your interpretation, I mean, that blew it wide open for me. I've read 2 Corinthians many times before, had no idea that was lurking behind the text. But before we get into some of your exegesis, tell us about the Apostle and the Empire and what motivated you to write the book.
Yeah, so originally I wrote a book on that very subject, on the methodology and the plausibility of this hypothesis that there's a kind of hidden criticism in Paul's letters. In 2015, it was published with the German publisher, Morsiebeck. And then for several years, I just followed the discussion, and it didn't really move on. And then in 2021, Laura Robinson, doctoral student at Duke, wrote an article in New Testament Studies on hidden transcripts. Now, hidden transcripts, that's a technical term from a sociologist, James Scott. He argues that there are different kinds of rules that apply in public and in private discourse. And in a society where you have the elites controlling what you can say in public, you usually don't have access as an historian to the private thoughts of the suppressed people. So and this has been applied to New Testament studies in a way that some people have suggested that we might have access in some form to this hidden transcript of Paul's churches in Paul's letters. And one reason for that, one reason that is given for this kind of hypothesis is that it would have been too dangerous to make public denouncements of the Roman emperor. So Laura Robinson, following earlier research by John Barclay, really argued forcefully in this article that no, actually, Paul could just have criticized the Roman emperor in public, and that there was no law against that, and basically there wouldn't have been any legal problems. I'm simplifying, but she really made a very forceful point. And initially reading that, I was quite convinced. I thought, oh, that's a good argument. Like she really makes some good points. It's a great article. Everybody should read it. And then the more I thought about it, the more skepticism was rising up in my head. And in the end, I just disagreed with everything. So I thought, okay, it would be cool to write this book where I get people to follow me through this process in some way. And by the way, I really encourage everybody to read Laura's article first and then to read my book and to see whether or not I'm able to convince them somehow that Laura's arguments in the end are not as convincing as they might seem at first. So yeah, that was the reason, the impetus for this book, for writing her article.
Yeah, well, let's go ahead and dive into your book. So you open up your book by describing a debate that took place between N.T. Wright and John Barclay. What was the nature of the debate between those two scholars? And then how does that relate to the academic conversation concerning Paul's understanding of the Roman Empire?
Yeah, so N.T. Wright has been a prominent figure in Pauline studies, obviously, for a long time. One of the founding fathers of the New Perspective, and also one of the founding fathers of this anti-imperial reading of Paul. He's been active in this field since the beginning of the 1990s. And then what I've heard from several sources, whose names I cannot disclose, what happened apparently was that when N.T. Wright was Bishop of Durham, he participated in a research seminar at the University of Durham, where John Barclay was professor, still is professor in New Testament. And apparently, he made a quite convincing case. So even some of the doctoral students of John Barclay were quite impressed and even convinced. So then later in 2007, they met again and had a debate about the same issue at the SBL meeting. So a meeting where many New Testament scholars and biblical scholars in general meet. John Barclay apparently really prepared well for this occasion, and then at the very last minute, it is decided that Wright would go first. So that had the effect that John Barclay would go first. So that had the effect that when Wright was giving his paper and he was making his arguments, the counter arguments already were known to the audience. And so for many, and you can listen to the audio recordings, it's fascinating on the internet, they are still there. For many, this was perceived as a takedown of the whole anti-imperial reading. And the article was later published in an anthology of John Barclay, now available through Eerdmans as a paperback version. In the article is called "Why the Roman Empire Was Insignificant to Paul." So he really made the case that the Roman Empire was insignificant to Paul, and it's such an effective article because it identifies several necessary conditions that would have to be true for Wright's hypothesis even to begin to make sense. And Barclay argues that several of these conditions just aren't met if you look at the historical evidence. So that was a very effective article, and I think it had convinced many scholars at that time that the whole idea of looking for hidden criticism isn't a really good idea.
And so, and just to kind of make sure that I have this worked out in my head, the perspective that N.T. Wright has is that Paul is extremely critical of the Roman Empire, but he has to veil his critique, hide it behind imagery and symbolism so that he doesn't offend the Roman authorities. And Barclay's point is that Wright is basically seeing something that's not there in the text.
Yeah, right. So Wright's point is that he's critical, Paul's critical, he can't say it in public, so he uses code. And Barclay makes several objections to that. He says, well, first of all, the Pauline letters were private letters. So they were hidden transcript in pure form. We get access to Paul's actual thoughts here. There's no reason for Paul to conceal anything. And then he says, well, and even if you made public criticism in the Roman Empire, that was quite possible. Like, you could say bad things about the emperor, and he brings certain examples from ancient texts. And then something that Barclay has not so much questioned, but others have questioned whether Paul even had some contact with imperial cults, whether that was even a phenomenon at that time. And then again, we could ask, even if Paul saw all these imperial cults, did he really think it's a big issue or not? Perhaps he just didn't care. And that's something where Barclay says, well, Paul saw all these things, but he didn't make a difference he didn't differentiate between idol worship and worship of the emperor. It was just one and the same thing. Paul intentionally, perhaps even, didn't single out the Roman emperor, didn't give him the honor of attacking him individually. So, and in the end, Barclay then says, well, and we see Paul make statements in his letters against idol worship, and that was very problematic in ancient society, because you seemed asocial, you seemed to provoke the gods. So and Paul doesn't pull any punches in that regard. So why would he make these offensive claims? But why do we think that at the same time he wouldn't also be brave enough to criticize the Roman emperor and to just accept the persecution that might come from that? So that was Barclay's pushback, and supplemented by other kinds of criticism that from people who followed him. But that's a very convincing overall case, I think, at least at first sight.
Yeah, and the way that you kind of conceive of it in your book is that you're going to go on to say that there's at least an element of truth to Wright's position that Paul does critique the Roman Empire, but it might not necessarily be in the manner of hidden criticism in the way that a lot of people that have followed Wright have understood it. And so in chapter 2 of your book, you have this really great insight where you say that Paul is kind of constantly negotiating between saying what is necessary to preserve the truth of the gospel, and then also what was necessary for the proclamation of the gospel to even remain possible for him. Could you kind of explain that dynamic and how that might help us think beyond the hidden criticism model that Wright created?
Yeah, so interestingly, I found reasons not to follow Barclay and other critics with respect to any of the necessary conditions that I just explained. So I thought all these necessary conditions of Wright's hypothesis are met. Just the last one, Paul's personality, that was very convincing to me, right? I mean, he is really open about his critique of idol worship. And also, I think in 1 Corinthians 2, 6-8, he talks about the rulers of this age who are perishing at the moment. Like, that's quite an offensive statement to make. Why would he be so critical and at this point and not in other cases? So why would he feel a need to hide his criticism at other places? It was just not convincing to me. And interestingly, it was Laura's article and pushback by students, by the way, that made me realize that Wright might have the better argument in that regard. Perhaps I just read that. A quote to you from Laura that actually was quite interesting to me and quite decisive. It's on page 70 and 71 on her article. I just quote it because it's a really good quote. She writes, "If we look at our earliest source for Paul's legal trouble, Acts, it seems that local officials did not need to know much about what Paul taught in order to find him dangerous. Paul's high conflict relationship with other Christians, his complicated status in non-Christian synagogues, and his mission to bring pagans into monolatrous worship of Israel's God made him a troubling figure already. Paul did not need to be found denouncing the emperor to end up in prison. His conflict with virtually every existing social group outside his own churches was a problem already. Paul was a frequent recipient of synagogue discipline. He disturbed the peace enough to earn corporal punishment. He made a habit of convincing pagans to abandon their religion and follow foreign gods. Wherever he went, there were riots. When placed in this context, Paul's eventual execution is not a mystery that needs to be explained with anti-imperial codes. Paul was a habitual, highly visible troublemaker, and his letters would not need to be decoded to prove that." And I read that and I thought, yes, you're right. I mean, that sounds exactly like a kind of person who already has a lot of trouble and who might just think that it's wise not to enter in any additional unnecessary trouble, right? And so because of this kind of line of thinking, I thought, okay, perhaps we just have to reckon with the possibility that Paul thought horrible things about the Roman emperor, just like every other Jew of his time and like all minorities who were marginalized in the Roman Empire. But yeah, perhaps he just didn't write these things down all the time, either in open or between the lines. But if we accept this kind of thought, we could still reckon with the possibility that at certain points we still get a kind of insight into this thinking, this critical attitude. And I think the hidden transcript model actually is quite good, because there are several ways in which a hidden transcript can become visible to other people. Like, for example, I could mistake this conversation here like a private conversation between the two of us. I could think that the rules of the hidden transcript apply, and could make statements that in public just are not good to make. Like, I could make misjudgments of that kind, and perhaps Paul made a misjudgment of that kind when he wrote a letter. Or we sometimes just don't know which kind of rules apply. Like, I'm speaking to you in the US. There are other cultural rules that I might not be aware of, like there are geographical, diachronical differences, and sometimes minorities even try to stretch the boundaries of what kinds of rules you can break, perhaps without too much sanctions. And then there's just the possibility that Paul, in the heat of passion, made some statements that give us insight into this hidden transcript of his community that perhaps weren't really wise to make, that might have been dangerous. But he just, he didn't think that much about it, or he just felt like he had to make that statement about the rulers of this age who are perishing at the moment, for example. So I think these are all options that we have to reckon with, and they have nothing to do with Paul trying to hide something between the lines necessarily. It's just something that happens in communication, and it might not be that exciting, I think, then decoding criticism like in a Dan Brown fashion. I always like to explain my research like with a reference to Dan Brown, right? But still, I think it's a very historically plausible scenario, and something that still might give us some very valuable insights.
Yeah, and one of the points that you made that I really love, because I never really thought about it like this. I think when people think about the political posture that Paul has towards the Roman Empire, they either think that he's an out and out social reformer in the 21st century sense of the term, or that he just completely ignored the Roman Empire as if it wasn't even a factor in his preaching of the gospel. But the words that you use to describe Paul's stance towards Rome are unease and discomfort, and you kind of imply in your book that those might be better ways of explaining Paul's attitude towards the Roman Empire. Why is a sense of unease or discomfort with Rome a better way of conceptualizing Paul's understanding of the Roman Empire?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I'm not that sure about it, but my feeling is that if we use the term criticism, at least in some contexts, it might imply that you utter this criticism with respect to the person that is criticized, right? And that's not what Paul is doing. Paul is not writing a letter to Caesar, right? That's not what he's doing. He's writing a letter to his judges. And so I don't think it's his primary intention to make negative statements about the Roman Empire. But still, just if we assume that Paul didn't like Caesar or the different emperors, if we have reason to assume that he felt an unease with respect to certain military dimensions, for example, of the Roman Empire, I mean, it's only reasonable to suspect that this just might come to the surface of the text at certain points. And I'm probably also influenced here by my research on narratives in Paul, where I just recognized that Paul tells many stories. Like, the idea that Paul doesn't tell stories and just makes arguments all the time is just wrong. There are many, many stories, but sometimes he just uses hints, because he and his readership, they share a common experience, and they share a common pool of stories. So Paul can make use of this background knowledge and can just use hints. And it's not something special. It's not a kind of code that he uses, nothing that we need to decode. It's just a normal way of communication. And I think this, just the unease with the Roman Empire, is something very similar. It's a shared lived reality between him and his readers. Something fears that they shared, for example, experiences of executions perhaps that they shared, experiences of the same kinds of mechanisms of suppression. And so, I think these things come to the surface of the text, just like other experiences as well, and other stories that circulate in early Christian communities.
Yeah, and his audience would be obviously in a position to pick up on some of those nuances in his writing in a way that we as 21st century Western people aren't able to
Exactly.
process.
Yeah.
Yeah. You explain in the book that being a Christian in the Roman Empire was always dangerous, but I know that there are, and you outline this in your book a little bit, there have been scholars that have pushed back on that, or I guess there have been scholars who have said over the last 50 or 60 years that it wasn't always dangerous for Christians within the Roman Empire. But you make the claim that it was to a certain extent. Can you explain that? Why is it the case that there was always at least a little bit of an element of danger for the Christians in the Roman Empire?
So I have to say that that's an area where I myself learned a lot in writing that book, and it changed the way I think about the whole issue now. So for a long time in scholarship, there was this paradigm that actually the Roman Empire was quite good for the Christians, because you had the roads, you could travel on the roads, right? You had the peace that Augustus had established. So even church fathers sometimes make the point that Christianity and the Roman Empire go well together, because God used the Roman Empire to prepare the way for Christianity. And they sometimes make this argument specifically to show to the Roman Empire, you see, we actually are your friends. We don't say any negative things about you, stuff like that. So, and this paradigm from the church fathers was also accepted by many scholars. For example, in Germany, a historian called Molthagen, and he was very influential. He basically said that every Christian document that we have that talks about persecution or some kind of negative experience with Roman state officials must be after a point in time when Christianity became illegal, because before that, as law-abiding officials, if you were a Christian, you had nothing to fear, right? And so he makes this argument that basically it's under the mission that we have a law that really bans Christianity, and we have this exchange, the letter exchange between a governor of Bithynia and Pontus around 110 CE, called Pliny, and the emperor at the time, Trajan, and Pliny executes Christians. And Molthagen makes this point that, well, yeah, we see here that apparently at that point in time there was a law from the mission that Pliny presupposes. And now Christianity is illegal and you can be executed for being a Christian. But before that, everything was fine. Like, okay, we had Nero in Rome, but it was just local. And and now what opened my eyes was research by James Cork Webster, who's a scholar, historian at the University of Durham. And he wrote an article on this correspondence called Trouble in Pontus. And he points out that the whole paradigm that we've used to read this correspondence is just wrong. It's not about Christianity being already illegal. It's also not about Trajan making Christianity illegal or somehow making it less illegal. It's not a matter of religious policies at all. Like, what happens is just that Pliny is in a horrible position that he has to decide about hundreds of court cases in very few days. And there's a group of people, of troublesome people that are brought before him, and there are accusations that he doesn't understand. He doesn't find any fault with the people, but in the end, he thinks, well, they might be troublesome, so I just execute them. So the Christians are executed not because they are Christians, but because they are a minority and because of a shoot-first policy that this governor adopts. And this just shows that the whole question of under which Caesar did it become dangerous to be a Christian is just wrong entirely. It's a category mistake. It's not about religious policies. As a minority, the Christians were under a certain danger from the beginning. Christianity was never illegal throughout the first 2 centuries, but it also was never harmless. If you had neighbors who were dissatisfied with you because your faith somehow had economic consequences for them, which is probably also what happened under Pliny, they could just go to the governor and say, these people, they have these strange meetings and they're asocial, and also I don't see them that frequently in the temple, and I don't know what they think about the gods and the emperor, and just stuff like that. And on a bad day, that might just have been enough to be killed, right? It's as easy as that. So that's really an eye-opening essay by James Cork Webster, and because it shows that we shouldn't make these differences, like Revelation shows that now Christianity is illegal and under Paul everything was all right. No, there was a certain danger always, and Christians would have known always, because they followed a guy who was executed under a Roman governor, right? I mean, we sometimes forget that.
Yeah. So where we're at so far in your argument is that Paul definitely does have a sense of unease or discomfort towards the Roman Empire. And while that's often a part of his hidden transcript, it often bubbles to the surface in his letters. And that there is a sense that even though there's not a formal legal structure against the early Christian movement, there is a danger of being a part of a minority group in the Roman Empire. And so a lot of your arguments in this book center around 2 Corinthians 2:14. And your exegesis on this passage is absolutely brilliant. I mean, it is an incredibly deep dive into the significance of this text. And so I kind of just want to open this up to you and let you run with it. Can you explain 2 Corinthians 2:14 and how what Paul is saying in this passage that I have been overlooking for my entire life? What is he saying, and how does this relate to your argument about Paul's unease towards the Roman Empire?
Yeah, so this book was the opportunity to somehow summarize my research on 2 Corinthians 2:14. I've already written a whole book on just this one verse, on just this one word, thriamvevo, this verb that Paul uses there. And it was a great opportunity now to summarize that argument and to really ask the question what the implications are for this Paul and Empire debate. It's central to my book because, interestingly, this verse hasn't really featured in the discussion about Paul and Empire. It has been cited sometimes, but even N.T. Wright, for example, translates it or explains it in his commentary as being about the celebration of victories of generals and military leaders or something like that. So even N.T. Wright doesn't make a connection between this verse and the Roman Empire. I think that the Roman Empire is here very prominent because this verb thriamvevo is used with direct object for the presentation of captives, of prisoners of war in the Triumphus, the Roman triumphal procession, which was celebrated in Rome after very significant military advancements. And it's interesting to see how different versions translate this verse, right? I mean, the King James Version has thanks be to God who always gives us triumph. And I think most people read this and think, oh, it's about being victorious in our life. And I doubt that most people think about the ritual in Rome, right, when they hear that, because triumph for us no longer has this kind of meaning. And there have been many proposals in the literature that say, well, it's about a pagan procession or an eschatological victory celebration by God or something like that. But if you really look at the verb, it's a technical term and it's always used to imply a specific context, namely Rome, the capital. There are one or two passages in antiquity where it's used for a victory celebration outside of Rome, but it's very clear that it's like really sacrilege to pretend that you could celebrate something like that outside of Rome. So it evokes Rome, it evokes the Roman capital, and it evokes the triumphator, who is, of course, the Roman emperor at that time. And when I then looked at the sources and I noticed that during Paul's lifetime, there was only a single emperor who celebrated a triumphal procession, namely the Emperor Claudius in 44 CE. I thought, well, it's interesting. The literature almost never mentions this connection. And I think it sheds light on Paul's use of this strange imagery where he portrays himself and his co-workers as captives in God's triumphal procession. And I think primarily the metaphor is directed not against Caesar, but against the Corinthians. So the Corinthians take issue with the chaotic missionary movements of Paul, and that he doesn't stay where he's evangelizing so successfully, but that he's moving away from that in order to meet Titus. And I think that's not a success story. That's not the kind of missionary, the kind of apostle that we like. And Paul uses this image to say, well, I know I look that bad to you. I look like somebody who's shamefully presented to the crowd in Rome after military defeat. But actually, the one in power is the triumphant, is God. So if you have an issue with me, you have an issue with God. So that's a very powerful way of picking up the perception of the Corinthians and to criticize this kind of perception, to transform it in some way. But still, I mean, there's at the same time, I think, a very clear subversive potential of this kind of metaphor. It's not a metaphor that a Roman person would use, because you push out the Roman emperor out of his triumphal chariot and replace it by the Jewish God, a God who's always been quite suspicious to the Romans. So that's something very strange to do, and I think the people in Corinth wouldn't have missed these overtones and the significance of that, especially since in Corinth we have evidence for a cult that was established specifically for Claudius' victory over Britannia. So we know that there were cultic events taking place in Corinth at the time that Paul was writing this letter. And we know that Claudius himself was very prominent in Corinth, and he had just died. And Paul perhaps even met some eyewitnesses in Corinth when he met Priscilla and Aquila, who had just have to leave Rome because of Claudius, who sent away all the Jews. So we have all these things coming together there in Corinth, that I think it's a very plausible option that at least Paul and his audience thought to some extent about the recent triumphal procession by Claudius, which, by the way, was not very successful, apparently, in making a really good celebration and showing around captives, because Claudius just went to Britannia for a couple of days and then returned. And people noticed that he just made this military advancement in order to make the celebration, and that he didn't really have any famous captives to show around. So I think Paul, with this kind of critical metaphor and the resonance that this creates, participates in a probably public dialogue where people, not just Christians, were talking about Claudius and mocking Claudius, perhaps. So it's very interesting, because we see that Paul is, in fact, really interested in the politics of his days. He uses this, at least. He interacts with events that take place. He's not, like John Barclay wanted to imply, totally disinterested in the Roman Empire. He observes, and he critically observes, and he comments on these issues.
Yeah, and I guess, this is one of the phrases that N.T. Wright uses over and over again, but this would be a great example of a case where, Paul would make the claim that because God is king, then Caesar is not. And so he's applying language that would have been used exclusively for the Caesars in the Roman world to Israel's God.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. We have in Roman literature one or two places where there's also play with this metaphorical play with the triumph language, but there too, it's not innocent. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting to see that obviously it all begins with what Claudius does, right? It's not that Paul wants to find a way to somehow subvert the Roman Empire or to take Claudius down, but Claudius, with his military celebration and with this exaggeration of his person that took overtones of the divine, certainly, and then the cult that followed, right, with sacrifices in Corinth, certainly was something that Paul just would not have liked based on his Christian ideas and his worldview. So Paul would have perceived of this event as a challenge to his worldview. It's not Paul who wants to challenge the emperor, but the emperor kind of comes into his sphere. So Paul pushes back with the metaphor, right?
Yeah, that's a really great way of putting it. Where would you see other examples in the Pauline literature of Paul kind of openly expressing his unease towards the Roman Empire? Or where else would his language have come in conflict with Roman political ideology?
So, I mean, many of the passages that are usually discussed in this debate could probably be explained as not some kind of elaborate coding, but something that actually was quite obvious at that time. Something that I've worked on recently and presented on recently at the SBL meeting is Galatians, which is not a text that often features in this discussion. It features insofar as some people think that the imperial cult and the idea that if Christians are perceived as being part of Judaism, they do not have to participate in the imperial cult, and that's why people want to get the Galatians circumcised. So this idea circulates in the literature, and I don't think it's correct. I don't think that the actual issue of circumcision in Galatia has anything to do with imperial cults. But still, it's very notable that at least if the letter is written to the southern part of the Galatian province, which I happen to believe. Paul writes this letter when the governor, for the first time in decades, is in the area. So the people who are reading this letter have a front seat to witness Roman government. And that includes probably executions, for example, like Pliny later does. So we don't know whether this includes crucifixions, but it's possible. And crucifixion was always an issue that, at least as a slave, you had an option that you had to reckon with. It's something that can happen to you in the Roman Empire. And I mean, we have the mention of slaves, right, in Galatians 3:28. So against that backdrop, I found it really interesting how abstract our analysis of crucifixion language in Galatians always is. Of course, we know in Galatians 3:1, Paul talks about Jesus as being presented as a crucified person to the Galatians, but it would have meant something else to them back then, especially if you have ever witnessed a crucifixion, something of the most horrendous event that you could imagine, right? And then if you look at how the verb for crucifying is used in this letter, I mean, it's from a Roman perspective, that's some of the strangest things that you could do. Paul in 2:19 says that he is crucified with Jesus on the cross. Like, what are you trying to say here, Paul? I mean, that's the same verb that the Gospels use for the other criminals that are crucified together with Jesus, right? And what does it mean for you to be crucified? I mean, it's like me saying I'm sitting on an electric chair, right? I mean, very strange way of speaking. And I think today, for us, people who no longer have to reckon with the possibility of being executed through crucifixion, we might miss the kind of how do I put it? The comforting element of the idea that I've already undergone a process that is death-like. The Roman Empire, with even this most horrendous persecution that they can offer me, is not that bad. It's not something that is totally unfamiliar to me. So I think that's an example where Paul doesn't want to attack the Roman Empire, but he uses the language of crucifixion in a way that would be very strange to Roman officials or Romans in general. And then in 6:14 again, we have the verb again without the prefix this time, and this time we even have the world that's crucified to me, or cosmos. Well, what's cosmos? I mean, it's not exclusively the Roman Empire, but to a large degree, the world of that time is the Roman Empire. What does it mean for the Roman Empire to be crucified? I mean, it's a totally strange idea for a Roman person to think. How could the Roman Empire be crucified? What's the implication of that? I mean, the Roman Empire is the entity that executes other people. It's not executed, right? How is that possible? And in 5:24, we even have the Galatians who apparently crucified their sins with Christ. Like, what does that mean? We have to imagine the Galatians as people who are active in crucifixion. Like, that's something Roman soldiers do, right? You don't use that verb for a strange minority of a strange cult. It's not something you do. And perhaps we are so used to think about crucifixion in theological terms, and of course Paul uses crucifixion and gives it great theological importance. But still, at that time, it was just execution, and very horrible execution. And it's very strange that Paul talks so much about that for a Roman perspective, for Roman ears. So, yeah, I mean, obviously Paul thinks crucifixion is important for theological reasons, and he brings it up all the time. But in doing that, he creates a discourse that stands in tension with everything that we know from Roman sources. So that perhaps might be an example where you see Paul behaving in a way that would just be unimaginable to an average Roman author.
Yeah, it just creates dissonance with the Roman culture, the
Yes.
message of the gospel. And yeah, another one that I wanted to ask you about here too. I was reading through another scholar, Joshua Jipp. He has a book called The Messianic Theology of the New Testament. And I think he teaches at Wheaton or something like that. But he argues in that book that the theme that binds together all of the works that are in the New Testament is Jesus's messianic status. And for him, that's the king of Israel, the Messiah of Israel. And so he talks a little bit about the political ramifications of that messianic claim at the end of his book. Would you say that Paul's Christology is one of those things like the cross that is just inherently in conflict with the Roman Empire?
Yeah, I mean, I would basically agree with that idea. I do think that it depends also to some degree on what specific Roman emperors do at specific times. So it's always about to what degree do Roman emperors make claims that are reserved for Jesus in Paul's view. So I'm open to the idea that Paul might have viewed some emperors more positively than others. But basically, yes, there's an inherent conflict in not just Pauline, but early Christian Christology in general. And it's a conflict that manifested itself specifically, I think, whenever the Christians did something that, again, was suspicious to their neighbors. So from a Christian perspective, the Roman Empire is at odds with Christology. And then from the pagan perspective of the neighbors of Christianity, Christianity is at odds with their society whenever they do stuff that's quite weird from their perspective, like not going to the usual festivals and meeting once a week and being conspiratory, like stuff like that, you know? So I think there are these two dynamics, and when both dynamics reach a certain threshold, then you have conflict, and then we see it in the text, and then it might even have real life consequences and quite deadly consequences.
Yeah, no, I love that analysis. One of the passages that you deal with in your book might be one of the most controversial passages in the New Testament, maybe of all time. And I know that, for people that have, anytime that anyone talks about the Bible and politics or the way that we should relate to the state or Paul's opinion on the Roman Empire, everyone discusses Romans 13, 1-7. And there are a million different interpretations of that passage there. And you deal with it head on in your book. What is going on in Romans 13, and how does that relate to your thesis of Paul's unease or discomfort with Rome?
Yeah. I finally had to address that passage, right? I didn't do that in earlier publications. I knew I had to do it this time. Yeah, so my general idea is the following. If Romans 13, 1-7 were indeed a discussion of the Roman Empire or the state and Christianity, the church and the state and the relationship between the two entities, then it would be a very unnuanced discussion. And it would be a very strange discussion because Paul in this section says in verse 4 that the authorities, whatever you think he's referring to, do not carry the sword in vain. And he makes the case that basically, I'm paraphrasing, basically, if you do bad things, you will get punishment, you will be killed. And if you do good deeds, if you are a good citizen, nothing will happen to you. And if that's indeed what Paul is saying here, it's just one of the most short-sighted statements a person could make in this situation. As a follower of a person who was executed by the Romans. It would evoke the question, so what about Jesus? Does the Roman Empire also not carry the cross in vain? What did Jesus do wrong to be crucified? Was it correct for him to be crucified? So, if indeed Paul made the case that many people think he made, it was a really naive case he made. And I don't think he did it that first because the passage is quite detailed. So it's not just a statement that you make and then you realize, oh no, that was stupid, right? Jesus, oh no, he died on a cross, right? That's not what he did. He repeats these elements even. He makes it very clear. I wrote on this in my dissertation, so it's really impressive. Paul really wants to emphasize whatever he's emphasizing. So it's not just a side remark. And as not being a side remark, it just would be very, it would lack nuance, and it would invite criticism by his readers. And we just talked about 2 Corinthians 2:14. Paul is reacting here to what he imagines is the reaction of his readers to his chaotic travel movements, based on how they reacted earlier when he didn't come to Corinth, even though he had said he would come and stuff like that. So he apparently thinks about his audience and how they react to his text. And in Romans in particular, he's in a fictional dialogue all the time. So it's very implausible to me that he would pen this section, that he wanted to write about the relationship between Christians and the state, and it didn't cross his mind how vulnerable his position would be. So because of these reasons, I have sympathy for people who think, no, the whole section is just irony. Like, Paul doesn't think that God really installed the Roman emperor, right? No, he thinks the opposite. And when Paul says, well, they don't carry the sword in vain, what he actually means is, well, I mean, these are killers, right? So I have some sympathy for that, but in the end, I'm not convinced, because even though it's quite in line with how people would write ironical statements in antiquity, I think that can be shown. That's not a problem. But it's just unclear to me what Paul, in this paradigm, would expect of the Romans to do. Does he want them to pay the taxes? Apparently an issue there. Or just think, well, I'm doing it, but I, of course, know that these people are just not, they are just God's puppets or something like that. Or does he want them not to pay the taxes? Like, what's the consequence of this parody? It just seems to me that it would introduce so much confusion that it's not likely, in my opinion, that Paul would use such a route. So if we reject these two options, I think what we are left with is the idea that the whole section is not about the relationship between Christians and the state, or anything that comes close to such a general statement of political ethics. And I think there are several indications, and I talk about some of them in the book. This strange mention of taxes in verse 6, and the fact that we can't really follow which authorities are even in view here. So it's difficult to make any precise statement, but what I think is going on is that we have a very specific situation going on here, where people are expected to make certain payments in Rome, and apparently some people think they shouldn't do that as Christians, and Paul is very insistent on them doing just that, because he does not want the community to just be executed as a whole, right? I mean, he obviously, people think he's very naive. I think he's very realistic about what could happen to the community, and we learn a few years later, of course, under Nero, that these horrible things happen indeed. So I think it's a very specific problem, and Paul really uses a lot of theological arguments to make that case. But it's such a specific case that he doesn't think that anybody who reads that and knows the situation, which we don't, would generalize from this and say something like, well, are you saying the Caesars are appointed by God? Are you really saying that Jesus was executed for good reason and stuff like that? And yeah, so that's my kind of solution, even though it's not a really good solution, but it's just what I deduce basically from what we know about Paul and what we know about what he and other Jews thought about the Roman Empire at the time. So I think it has to be something like that. And in the book, I argue that it's actually quite similar to something that we can observe these days with how people use Romans 13. So I use the example of late night show host Stephen Colbert, who thought it was very funny when a judge made this reference to Romans 13 to put somebody in her place who participated in the insurrection on January 6th. So, like, he thought it's very funny to say to such a person, like, yeah, you should obey the law, right? At the same time, he didn't find it funny at all when Jeff Sessions used that very same passage to argue for law and order, right, with respect to the immigration policies that the Trump White House had at that time. So obviously, apparently, Colbert could think that's a good kind of argument, a good kind of line of reasoning, without, in this specific situation, thinking about the more general implications of relying so much on theological arguments when it comes to obedience to the state. And so, I mean, Gerd Theissen has this interesting dialogue, fictional dialogue between Luke and Paul at the very end before Paul is executed. And Luke asks Paul, didn't you write that in a rather misleading way? And Paul basically answers, well, yeah, I was a bit naive. And I think it's a very interesting thought to think, what would Paul say right before his execution about this passage? And I disagree with Gerd Theissen because, to some extent, because I don't think that Paul was naive at that point in time. He did reckon with the possibility of being executed several times throughout his life, and for good reason, because that was what Roman governors could do and would do to minorities. But yeah, perhaps Paul would have said, yeah, I mean, it's at least misleading in that many people could take this and apply to general political theology or something like that, which is, of course, precisely what has happened over the last 2,000 years.
Yeah, and I think this goes back to the point kind of like that you made earlier in the book, that Paul's negotiating between the truth of the gospel and what would make the preservation of the gospel possible. I think that, I mean, it definitely seems like, based on what you said, that dynamic's at play. And also you kind of alluded to the fact that everyone wants Paul to be on their side, and people want Paul to answer political questions that we have today. And so they expect that the Apostle Paul is going to be a political philosopher like John Locke or Thomas Hobbes or somebody like that. And he's just not giving us that kind of. That's not what he's trying to do.
Yeah, perhaps he was. I mean, perhaps he did have these thoughts. Perhaps he did have these discussions. I mean, it's possible, right? But we only get these kinds of hints, and we have to be careful not to take these hints as reflections of the political discussions that perhaps he had at some point with some people.
Right. So what would you say then, what are the political ramifications for the church of today for the thesis in your book, and how should the church approach politics? What would be your thought on that?
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, of course, that goes beyond the scope of the book. But at the same time, of course, I mean, I'm writing this book also with an eye to how the church in general relates to politics, and with respect to some dynamics that I don't like personally, or because of my reading of Paul. So most importantly, I think the book highlights that we can find material in Paul that offers the church some kind of potential for resistance against oppressive regimes. So I think that's an encouraging result, actually, and it has to be seen how far that helps us in under specific circumstances that, of course, are different today compared to antiquity. But that's the most obvious result. Then I think also just my whole interaction with 2 Corinthians 2:14 has made me very critical with respect to a kind of triumphalism that I sometimes see active in Christian circles. So for me, it was a really striking experience when I visited Rome some years ago, and I was in a building in which the Emperor Constantine, the first Christian emperor, was supposedly baptized right before his death. So he waited some time, and then before he died, he got baptized. Legend is that it was there. It probably wasn't there, but it's an old building. So it's very fascinating to be in this room and to see this place, and then you look at the wall and you see a painting, and the painting depicts the emperor, the Christian emperor, who returns to the city in a Roman triumphal procession and holds in his hand the head of his enemy, Maxentius. So that, for me, just is a very striking contrast between Paul, who depicts himself as a captive, shamefully being presented in a Roman triumphal procession, and then this Roman emperor, Christian emperor, if you want, who enters the city as triumphator with the head of his enemy in his hand. And it kind of, yeah, I mean, for Constantine, God was the one who gave him the triumph in the sense of the military victory, and to in that matter also gave him the triumphal procession, enabled him to celebrate that military victory through the triumphal procession. And many Christians following in the following centuries have taken the passage to somehow mean that God gives us victory. Thanks be to God who gives us victory in all kinds of instances, and of course also in our political endeavors. So being victorious for Christians has been quite important over a long time. And for example, Trump with his promise to for the Republicans to always win, getting sick of winning. Of course, that resonates with that kind of passage and that kind of triumphalism that people take from that passage. And I'm just hesitant about to what extent Paul. No, I'm quite certain Paul would not have liked that kind of triumphalism, and this metaphor in particular, in the humble attitude behind it, I think stands in a stark contrast with this kind of triumphalism. Of course, situations were different. Paul didn't have the opportunities of making Christian politics through democratic institutions, but I think he would have been very critical of just thinking about Christian politics primarily in terms of Christian ideas and establishing these Christian ideas through the mechanism of a triumphal procession through democratic institutions. I think Christian politics for Paul, or if you read Paul critically, we today might think about Christian politics not just in terms of its content, but also in terms of the manner in which we implement certain things. And Paul is quite clear in many places that he doesn't reckon with the possibility of Christianity being somehow victorious before Christ returns. It's a different matter after Christ returns. Then people will judge the angels and also the emperors probably. But before that happens, he just reckons with the possibility that the Christians will always be a marginalized group. And he's very keen whenever the issue is the interaction with society, that Christians make sacrifices in order to, on the one hand, secure their own existence and the continuity of their existence, but also in order to show people that their community offers an alternative to society around them. And so I think Christian politics for Paul would have been connected a lot with making decisions that actually mean making sacrifices, making decisions that are not in your own interest. So yeah, I think but that goes beyond the historical arguments that I make in the book. But I think it's something that one can explore, at least beginning with these historical results.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful way of putting it. And I agree with pretty much everything you said there. Just as we begin to wrap up here, for people that want to continue to track some of this down, you dedicated your book to Laura Robinson, and I actually found out about her work through her podcast, the NT Review, which is a really great one that reviews a bunch of classics and biblical scholarship. So it's great. Who are some of the other rising stars in the field of biblical scholarship right now?
Yeah, so I actually dedicated the book due to her and all other early career researches, and it was important to me because I actually wrote that book, or the first draft, as a job talk at a university, and I didn't get a job, but I could hand in the manuscript to the publisher before I got a rejection letter from the university, so that was a good feeling. But I wrote all that under the awareness of how difficult it is to be a early career researcher, and so I have difficulties with this whole thought of being a rising star in academia, just because academia doesn't allow the right persons to shine sometimes as stars. That doesn't bring forth the right qualities sometimes. But at the same time, the whole book was also encouraging because it's a dialogue between early career researchers, and I think Laura and I managed to produce a productive dialogue in this. So yeah, all that, these qualifications being said, and I don't want to prioritize anybody unduly, but perhaps I can just point to some of the people that I met at SBL recently, and we had discussion about Paul and Empire, and the New Testament and empire in general. And some of these scholars are producing excellent works. We met Mike Bird, was part of that group, but he's a senior researcher, of course. But there's also Najib Haddad. He has already written a good book on empire, and has a forthcoming book with Wipfenstock, should be published now, I think. And he's also very critical of the whole approach. So if you are interested in a junior researcher who's critical of the whole paradigm, then that might be a good book to watch. I think it's called Empire Criticism. I'm not entirely sure, but you will find it if you Google his name. And also, I met Justin Vinzenberg. He recently wrote a book on Ephesians and empire, and I think it's I haven't read the whole book yet, but from what I've read, it's really an impressive step forward in that he uses speech act theory in a really creative way, and I think that a way that's helpful in bringing out this question of what would it mean to be critical of the Roman Empire? So what are different levels of meaning, and how does communication actually function in that respect? And perhaps Laura Hunt, she's written her thesis on John and interacts with ideas of empire criticism in that, and the way Jesus is contrasted with Caesar in the Gospel of John. So I think these scholars would, if you are interested in empire specifically, would be scholars that I've recently met with, and with whom I recently discussed empire in a very productive way, and who I think have a lot to contribute to this conversation.
Yeah, and so for people that want to get their hands on some of the classic texts that deal with the debate around Paul and the Roman Empire, what are some of the great books or the formative books or kind of the landmark studies? Which of those would you recommend for people that want to track this argument down further?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I have to say N.T. Wright. Neil Elliott also has a lot of common arguments with N.T. Wright. He also uses Richard B. Hayes criteria for identifying echoes of the empire and stuff like that. But Neil Elliott is coming from a kind of different direction, more Paul within Judaism thought, of school of thought. So I would think with N.T. Wright, you have the classic argument, the classical case for coded criticism in Paul. And then just read John Barclay's article. I mean, it's the best critical article that has ever been written on the subject, I think. And if you just have these two, then you already have the whole debate. And if you want, you can download my 2015 book on the subject. It's called Hidden Criticism, and I've made it open access because it brings Wright and Barclay into dialogue and covers a lot of these methodological issues. So you can also find a lot of the literature through that. I should add, though, that this whole discussion that I've sketched is very text-centered. And there are other scholars who are more interested in the social dynamics behind the text, who use the text as data points in order to reconstruct the events behind the text. So Bruce Winter, for example, would be a scholar who's written on this Divine Honors for the Caesars, published with Erdmans. So that's just if you want to get another perspective on this whole debate. But if you're really interested in the textual stuff and how these ideas about empire shed new light on difficult passages, then yeah, read N.T. Wright, read John Barclay, perhaps look into my book, and then read Laura Robinson's article, and then read my new book.
Perfect. One last question before I let you go. Give us the pitch for why people should read and study the Apostle Paul.
Well, I mean, obviously, the Apostle Paul is very influential. I mean, just we've talked about Romans 13. So whether you like him or not, there's just no way around the fact that his letters are very influential for all aspects of our cultural lives. And sometimes we don't know because we think, we only know the stories, right? The Exodus from the Old Testament and the Gospels and Christmas, stuff like that. But Paul, through his influence on theologians such as Augustine, and then later in the Reformation, has been very influential in all spheres of our lives. So whether you like him or not, I think it's important to study Paul. And also, I deviate here from some current trends in scholarship, but I think Paul actually is a much better thinker and much better storyteller than many would like to admit. So I think there's a lot to gain from Paul, especially if we remind ourselves of the context in which he wrote, and just this oppressive regime that stood in the background of everything. And so if I don't like if people can't give Paul any credit and just think, well, he's so interested in ethical behavior and I don't like it. Yeah, it's ethical behavior that keeps your neighbors from keeps them from bringing you before the governor and getting you killed. So unless you are in a similar situation, perhaps don't be that critical about that. Of course, we need to read Paul critically. We have to be aware of the fact that his texts are used by different sides. Like, for example, as I write in the book, a verse from Ephesians is also used in the January 6th riots. So we need to read him critically, and by no means I think he's above reproach. But I think he has a lot to contribute, and I think people don't give him the credit that he deserves.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Christoph Heilig, this has been excellent. Where can people follow you and find out more about your work?
Well, I think Twitter is a good place. Usually, if we have like an event, an online research seminar or something like that, then you will find news there. You can also go to my academia page. There you can download the book that I talked about, and I try to make everything accessible there that I'm legally allowed to put online.
All right, perfect. Well, I'm going to put links to all of those in the show notes, and I really appreciate you having you on the show today. Thank you so much for making the time to come on.
Well, thank you for your interest, and it was a great conversation. I really liked talking to you. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments or thoughts about the show, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also follow me on Twitter @ProLibertyPod. Again, you can follow me on Twitter @ProLibertyPod. You can also support the show by leaving a rating or a review on your favorite podcast app. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we'll see you next week.